Hey everyone, welcome back to Engelbart Gaming. Today I've got another big video for you that includes every Sega game released on the various MSX computer platforms. Putting this video together was, well, a giant pain in the butt, and I'll explain why shortly. First, let's talk a little bit about the MSX. If you're from America like me, you might be asking, hey, what's an MSX? Well, the MSX was an early attempt at a standardized computer platform that could be built by many manufacturers. It was an 8-bit system whose initial design spec, internally, was basically the same as early game consoles like the ColecoVision and the SG-1000. It was powered by a Z80 CPU, had a simple square wave PSG, and pretty basic graphics. The MSX platform saw upgraded hardware over the years with the MSX2, MSX2 Plus, and eventually the Turbo R, which used a different processor altogether. These updates increased the specs of the hardware usually in a few ways, and there were various other add-ons released for the system. There are a lot of really awesome games on the MSX platforms. It famously has the original versions of the first 2 Metal Gear games, the first 3 Ys games, the first 2 Dragon Quest games, the first Final Fantasy, several Alesta games, the original Snatcher, 4 different Gradius/Salamander titles, and so much more. There were MSX computers manufactured by multiple companies like Sony, Philips, Yamaha, Canon, and so many others. The system was originally announced in 1983 and was pretty popular in Japan, selling over 9 million units. It also did okay in a few European territories, which leads to what made this video so hard to make. Now, the Japanese MSX releases were programmed specifically for the system, while the European games are almost always terrible direct ports from the ZX Spectrum. And yes, ZX. If you're from the UK and are offended by that, here's the deal. First, my heritage is Scottish, just one generation removed. Second, I'll call the computer the ZX Spectrum when you call the American-developed CPU inside the Z80 instead of the Z80. Sound fair? Let's move on. Anywho, despite the fact that the MSX has been emulated for decades, getting some of these European releases to run right was a challenge. So this video basically took a week longer than planned to put together while I tried to get some of this stuff working right. Props to Stika for trying to lend a hand, and he helped me get a game or two going. The rest, unfortunately, I had to just get up and running with a combination of research and trial and error. But I stuck with it, and here we are. Alright, sorry for the long preamble. Like usual, I show these games next to their original versions when possible, either arcade or home-based. They're also listed in alphabetical order regardless of region. So, let's get on with it. Okay, I'm so sorry to have to do this, but because of that whole pesky alphabet thing, we're leading with the European MSX port of Afterburner. As you can see, it's garbage. This Spectrum port has pretty much no value. It's ugly, it's slow, some of the music is way off and plays in the wrong places, and I can't even pretend to care about this version of the game anymore. MSX Afterburner is an abomination that should be avoided by any human being gifted with the following senses: sight, sound, and smell. Why smell? Because it stinks. Alright, I won't waste any more of your time with this one. Next! Here's Alibaba and the 40 Thieves. Obviously, this was an old Sega arcade title, and one that I completely forgot even existed until I decided to make this video. Visually, the MSX port isn't too far off from the arcade version. Gameplay-wise, it's a tad different. And overall, while the arcade version looks nicer and has a little cutscene at the beginning, smoother graphics, and more going on at one time, I think I actually prefer the MSX release, which has sort of a difficulty ramp-up that the arcade version lacks. Anyway, this game is sort of a Pac-Man-like maze game. You have to stop the thieves from stealing the money that you stole at the beginning of the game. One of the thieves is dangerous and can kill you, the others aren't. You have to kill so many thieves per level to advance to the next level. Little question marks show up now and then that have a few different random effects. They might make you giant and able to kill the aggressive thief, they might make you really fast, they might open the top of the screen for you to reclaim money stolen from you, or they might make the aggressive thief gigantic and hard to avoid. The sound in the MSX version is incredibly annoying, but otherwise, if you like Golden Age arcade games, you might get a few minutes of fun out of this one. Go ahead and check it out. Alright, now we have Alien Syndrome on MSX. How does it stack up to the arcade version? It's like putting a hunk of dog shit next to a giant cake and asking which you'd rather eat. No one ever picks the dog shit. Well, maybe some dogs. Anyway, this one is as slow as molasses. it looks bad, and it plays worse. The publisher should have been embarrassed to put this out. It is, of course, one of the terrible Spectrum ports that found their way to the MSX in Europe. It's sad to see stuff like this that doesn't take any advantage at all of the MSX's capabilities. The computer could have definitely handled a decent version of Alien Syndrome, either with choppy scrolling or just static screen transitions. Instead, it got dog swell. Another European Spectrum port. Altered Beast on the MSX sucks. I mean, there's not that much more to say, is there? The size of the characters is kind of impressive. The song here is kind of okay. The control is terrible, being poorly reduced to one button from the arcade's 3. The visuals, well, they're on a level of awful all their own. It's hard to see what's going on. The colors are garish, and the thing is just really busy, which makes it hard to focus on, and sometimes just difficult to tell what's going on, which is not at all an uncommon problem in Spectrum action games. See it here. Don't try it for yourself. It's not worth it. I suffered here so that you don't have to. You're welcome, retro gaming fans. Okay, here's an interesting one. What you're looking at is the arcade version of an old Sega Laserdisc game called Astron Belt. Astron Belt superimposes a few sprites on top of video and features simulated collision with backgrounds in a few places. As a game, well, it's terrible. As a piece of gaming history, it's pretty interesting. What's even more interesting than the arcade version, though, is that there's an MSX port of this game. Now, there were 2 models of the MSX capable of connecting to a Laserdisc player, and a version of Astron Belt was produced for the MSX that works on those 2 models. Here it is. Check it out. The overlaid visuals are way simpler than the arcade version, but the backgrounds are pretty much the same. There were a few parts I saw in the arcade game that I didn't see in the MSX version, but I'm not sure if that was just because some of the clips are random. So here they are side by side. And hey, imagine being able to play this at home in 1984. There was really nothing else like it at the time. This is probably the single most interesting game in this entire video. Now, I prefer the MSX version overall because the arcade version gets stupid hard with a hail of enemy lasers, while the MSX version has selectable difficulty levels. Getting this to work under emulation has some really specific requirements, but if you're interested in it, Google is your friend. Is this one worth checking out? Oh, definitely. Not a great game, but a piece of history. Next up we have Bank Panic. It's kind of a weird game where you'd have expected it to use a light gun, but it doesn't. In the arcade, you have 3 buttons, one for each door that enemies can pop out of. On the MSX, since it uses 2-button gamepads, you have 2 fire buttons and you have to use a directional press for the other door. It's a tad wonky at first, but you get used to it. I've never been a huge fan of Bank Panic, but it can be kind of fun in short bursts. Some of the things that happen when a door opens can be pretty funny at times. Now, gameplay for this one consists of trying to get a money bag under every numbered door. You have meters on top so you can see when someone will open the door. It might be someone good dropping off money, or it might be a bandit that's about to shoot you. Or it might look like someone good, who is then revealed to be a bandit, or is pushed out of the way by a bandit who then tries to shoot you. You have to pay close attention and be ready to fire in a split second, especially in later levels. Now on MSX, aside from the choppy scrolling, which isn't too much of a factor here, it's pretty good. A decent conversion of the arcade game. There are better home ports, but this one is alright, and yeah, sure, go ahead, give it a try. This is Champion Boxing on the MSX. This is a Japanese release from Sega, and Sega was so proud of this game, which also released on their SG-1000 console, that they ported it to the arcade. The arcade version is pretty much just the SG-1000 version, which is pretty much the same as this MSX version you're looking at now. It can be kinda mindless fun in very short playthroughs, but make no mistake, this ain't Punch-Out! It's a simple, side-view boxing game where one button selects the type of punch you want to throw, and the other button throws that punch. You can modify it to be high or low. Overall, not a great game. Definitely not a classic. But sadly, it's probably the best of the 5 champion sports games Sega released on the MSX. Which means, well, you know what you're in for the next few minutes here. Next up, Champion Ice Hockey. This is another game that appeared on both the MSX and SG-1000. It's slow and choppy, but I kinda like the super slippery ice physics. For some reason, they're kind of fun. They're almost downright comical. You have to plan how you want to move way in advance of when you actually do it. If this game was a little faster and smoother, it might have been fun. As it is, it pales in comparison to competing hockey games on other systems that came out roughly around the same time. Might be worth a look for a quick laugh or two, but definitely not a good hockey game. Champion Kendo is weird. I don't get how this game actually works. It uses a system not too dissimilar from Champion Boxing and Champion Wrestling, which we'll see shortly, but it feels like it does a lot of the playing and striking entirely on its own. This also came out for both MSX and SG-1000. As it stands, I've never been a fan of this one, and just find it to not be all that good. You might like it, but it's definitely not my thing. Next! Alright, here's Champion Pro Wrestling. It's another Japanese release that hit both the MSX and SG-1000. Once again, Sega quote-unquote ported this game to the arcade, releasing it on hardware that was essentially an SG-1000. Like the boxing game, you use one button to select moves and another to execute them. Once you get the hang of it, this game is kind of alright, but it never reaches its lofty goal of being, good. It's an interesting primitive take on the genre that some people will enjoy messing around with for a few minutes, but I think pretty much everyone will get tired of this one pretty quickly. Alright, here we are, the final Champion sports game. This is Champion Soccer, and is yet another title that appeared on both the MSX and SG-1000. And as you can see, it's not exactly all that great. It's slow, the control is weird, it's hard to get a player to kick and dribble the ball in the direction you want, and it's just sorely lacking in options. Now, I've liked a few soccer games over the years, including some really old ones, but I wasn't able to squeeze an ounce of fun out of this one. It's just boring and doesn't really have any particularly redeeming qualities. Considering when it came out, 1984 or 1985 depending on the version, it would have just been mediocre even back then. Now, it's just a footnote in history. Next! Now I've got something else that's pretty interesting for you. This is Sega's arcade title Zoom 909. In the US, it was known as Buck Rogers' Planet of Zoom, with some minor-ish changes to the game. As far as the MSX is concerned, there's a Japanese port of Zoom 909, and a European port of Buck Rogers' Planet of Zoom. Let's check out the Japanese version first, which also saw release on the SG-1000. This Japanese cartridge release starts with the famous trench run and wall scene. It has just a few of the many scenes from the arcade game, and then adds this weird overhead level with crazy controls. As an early release on the platform, this version of Zoom 909 isn't too bad. It's fun enough, it looks decent, and once you get the hang of the controls, particularly in the overhead scene, you can have some fun with this one. I'd say the Japanese game is definitely worth taking a look at. Now this is the European release of Buck Rogers' Planet of Zoom, and it'll look pretty familiar to anyone that watched my Every Sega Game on the C64 video. This looks a lot like that game and has the same areas as that version, along with the little earworm jingle that plays every time you finish a section. Like the C64 port, it's missing the trench run area and several other scenes from the arcade game. So gameplay-wise, Buck Rogers and the Planet of Zoom on MSX is very simple, but it still works well enough that you can have a little fun with it, even though it feels more limited and the scenes they chose aren't as interesting when compared to the Japanese release of Zoom 909. So out of the two games, I prefer the Japanese Zoom 909, but neither one of these is bad and they're both worth checking out if you want to kill a few minutes with a super old school chase view shooter. What you're looking at now is Columns for the MSX2. This is one of the few Japanese MSX Sega games that was actually released on floppy disk. Also, this version was from Telenet, who also did the PC Engine version of Columns. And, well, this is easily the best Sega game to appear on the MSX if you ask me. I mean, look at this. It looks really close to the Genesis version of the game. They really did a bang-up job here. The FM music in this version also sounds great. Again, really similar to the Genesis release of Columns. How does it play? Also fine. Columns isn't my favorite falling thing puzzle game, but I like it well enough. There are times I've spent hours playing Columns. And this MSX version? Well, it's good enough to spend hours playing. No, it's not a cool action or arcade game, but it still looks good and sounds great for the system it's on. What more could you ask for from Columns? I easily prefer this version to the one we looked at a while back on the X68000. This European disc release of Congo Bongo is pretty tragic. At first glance, it looks similar to the bad C64 version that has only 2 levels. And guess what? This version also has only 2 levels. Where it differs from the aforementioned C64 port is in the design of the main character and enemies. They all look worse here, and as you can see, pretty much nothing like the arcade original. Now, I can forgive some issues with a small early game. That early C64 port looked pretty rough, but from a gameplay standpoint, it was actually pretty good. And when you first start playing the MSX port of Congo Bongo, it seems like it's okay. The first level is fun enough and mostly works aside from a little bit of hokey collision detection issues. But the second and final level? I'm not saying the collision detection problems would drive the calmest person in the world insane, but holy f***, what the f*** were they thinking, and did anyone f***ing play this f***ing game? God. The subtle point I'm trying to make here that you may have missed is that you'll die often and for no apparent reason in the second level. This is not a good version of Congo Bongo. Plus, you've literally just seen the entire game. Here's a Japanese MSX title that may look familiar to many of you. This is Doki Doki Penguin Land, and this game was released for the MSX and SG-1000. You may, however, know it better from its follow-up release of Penguin Land for the Sega Master System. There was also a Mega Drive downloadable release in Japan that was later included in a compilation and is the third game in the series. But this game we're looking at here is the original. You take control of a penguin and guide an egg down to another penguin at the bottom of the level. While that sounds easy enough, there are enemies that will break the egg will crack if you fall on it when it has no room to move left or right, and the egg will also crack if it falls too far. Your valiant little penguin can dig up some of the ground to drop the egg down and also push certain blocks left and right. Doki Doki Penguin Land is a fun little action puzzle game no matter what platform it shows up on. I've always liked this game, even though I have to admit, I usually get tired of it after just a few levels. Still, it's a good genre title, and if you like puzzle games, it should be right up your alley, and is also one of the better games to show up in today's video. Next up we have Fantasy Zone, another Japanese release. With the MSX's scrolling problems and being limited to one color per sprite, as you can see, Fantasy Zone doesn't come off very well on the 8-bit computer platform. As you've probably guessed at this point, this just is not a good version of the original Fantasy Zone. Most of the appeal in the title has always been its silly, bright, colorful, cartoony visuals. When you strip those away, what are you left with? Just a subpar game that kind of resembles Fantasy Zone, but honestly isn't much fun to actually play. Go ahead and get a look at it for just a few moments here, and then never look at it again, because there's really not much point in playing this version of Fantasy Zone beyond satisfying some curiosity. Believe it or not, they tried again. Here's the Japanese MSX2 release of Fantasy Zone 2. This sequel originally appeared on the Sega Master System, and as you can see, the Master System version is vastly superior to the MSX version. The colors on the MSX are kind of mushy, and at times I would say actually physically hurt my eyes. They just get too bright and there's not a lot of contrast. It's not colorful, it's just bright. The music is kind of annoying, the gameplay is just okay, but at least there are a few minor improvements this time around. The scrolling is smoother, and the sprites are multicolor since this is an MSX2 game. They look a little better, but they still don't hold a candle to the Master System original. It's kind of a curious release for the hardware. The system definitely isn't suited for it, and I kinda have to wonder how this relatively late 1989 release even happened. You can have an okay enough time with Fantasy Zone 2, I guess. It's certainly not a disaster on the level of stuff like Congo Bongo or most European MSX ports, but if you're playing this version of Fantasy Zone 2, you're definitely playing the worst version of Fantasy Zone 2. Hey, here's one longtime Sega fan should recognize. This is Flicky, a Japanese MSX port of a Sega arcade title, where you play as one big bird who collects a bunch of little bird chicks and escorts them to the exit of the level. Your big bird is pursued by cats, who you can take out with some unconventional weaponry strewn throughout the level. The more little birds you get to the exit at one time, the more each one is worth, so you're encouraged to try and collect all the little chicks at once before you head for the exit. Flicky started life as an arcade title, as you can see on the left side of the screen here. There were ports to a few systems, the most famous of which was probably the Genesis/Mega Drive port. Flicky is a fun little action arcade game that's good for killing a few minutes when you've got some spare time. I'll also note that, like many Japanese titles on this list, Flicky also appeared on the SG-1000. On the MSX, Flicky is choppy, just as you'd expect, but despite that, in this case the game is so simple that it really doesn't affect very much. I mean, I'd rather the scrolling have been smoother and fluid like the Genesis port, but MSX Flicky is a fun little game regardless. So is Flicky on MSX worth checking out? Yeah, sure, why not? Okay, so this is the Japanese MSX title GP World. Again, there was also an SG-1000 release of this title. It's not a great racing game. Like a lot of early 8-bit racing titles, it's slow, bland, and not all that entertaining. What's kind of funny is that this game is technically kind of a port of a Sega arcade title called GP World, but that game is just a little different. How different? Look at this! The arcade version of GP World was a Laserdisc game. It's too bad they didn't also release an MSX Laserdisc version, but as I said in my look at Astron Belt, that add-on was extremely uncommon and only a couple of versions of the MSX hardware even supported it. Oh well. Just for funsies, here they are side by side. Yeah, that MSX version definitely looks a smidge different, huh? At least the different approach made this game worth taking a look at on both platforms if nothing else. Is the MSX release of GP World worth playing? Nah, it stinks. Well, looky at what we've got here. This is Gull Cave. Gull Cave, as you can see, is an early horizontal scrolling shooter, or shmup, released on both the MSX and SG-1000 in Japan. You might look at Gull Cave and think despite the fact that it's obviously pretty primitive, it did some interesting stuff. I mean, just check out all the parallax scrolling, or at least simulated parallax scrolling here, that they managed to incorporate. And everything moves relatively quickly and smoothly for an MSX game. Want to know the most interesting thing about Gull Cave? It was developed by Compile. That's right, the same company behind the beloved Alesta and Puyo Puyo series, along with other notable titles like Golvelius. They even have their little Alesta 1-up jingle in this game. How is Gull Cave as a game? Yeah, primitive really is the best way to describe it. It's not super compelling, the levels are long, the enemy patterns aren't great, there aren't really waves of enemies like we'd see in later shooters, and the power-up system is pretty baffling at first until you realize that the numbers you pick up add to a total, and at certain totals along the line, your weapon changes to a different one. After a group of levels, you'll encounter a pretty simple stationary boss. Overall, the game is kind of boring and tedious, and some of the weapons just suck. But I admit, I had a little fun with this one, and its heritage makes it more interesting than it might have been otherwise, since we can see some early glimmers of that Compile magic. Go ahead and check this one out. This is Arcade Hang-On. It's a classic. This is MSX Hang-On. Any questions? Okay, fine, slight elaboration. MSX Hang-On was a Japanese cartridge release, and is basically the same as the title Hang-On Jr. released for the SG-1000. They both pale in comparison to the arcade release and a later Sega Master System port. The control is bad, the road is just confusing, and the game isn't much fun to play. You can definitely give this one a pass. Next. Here's High School Kimingumi, another Japanese MSX title. I don't really know the history of the manga series on which this property is based very well. According to sources out there, it's about a bunch of weird Japanese middle school boys who form a club to basically worship this one girl that apparently showed them the slightest modicum of respect. The game itself reminds me of Konami's school-based early arcade title, Mikey. Now I'm not gonna lie, I've only ever played a little bit of this game because my knowledge of the Japanese language is a bit too limited for me to read everything and enjoy this one. I mean, it seems decent enough, I guess. There's also a Sega Master System version of this title, and the MSX version you're looking at here is a port of that game. Is it worth playing? I really don't know. If you can read Japanese fluently, give it a try and then you tell me. Next on the list is Sega's Ninja Princess. That's the arcade version on the left, of course, and the MSX version on the right. Yeah, we've got choppy scrolling, yada yada yada. Ninja Princess is a fun little game both on the arcade and on the MSX. My favorite version of this title, however, appeared on the Sega Master System under the name The Ninja, and while the gameplay was basically the same, it received a big graphical overhaul. But that's a story for another time. On MSX, Ninja Princess is fun, but it's actually hampered a bit by that super choppy scrolling I yada yada just a moment ago. The problem is, enemies can appear and vanish in a way that makes them difficult to see, track, hit, and, just keep an eye on their projectiles. If you play this game very deliberately and are willing to walk and scroll the screen backwards a lot, you'll be fine. You have two fire buttons. One fires straight up at all times, allowing you to strafe. The other fires in whatever direction you're facing. Hit them both together to go invisible for a split second to avoid some damage. There's also a handy power-up that makes your weapon bigger and stronger. You get a fair amount of levels and the gameplay is pretty fun despite the scrolling issues. So yeah, Ninja Princess on MSX, I'd say worth a look. But if you want the best version of this game, you've really got to go check out the Sega Master System port, which, again, was just called The Ninja.
トビットは知性のある星に生まれた MSX2 になって新登場。この進化はほんの始まりに過ぎない。
This is Arcade Outrun. There were two ports of Outrun to the MSX platform. The first one, which you see here, was a European port of the ZX Spectrum version of Outrun to the original MSX. Do I need to tell you what a god-awful crime against humanity this game is? It's bad. Really bad. If you can extract any enjoyment out of this title, I applaud your hyper-developed sense of fun. Next up, we have a Japanese-developed version of Outrun for the MSX2. It looks like a stripped-down version of the Sega Master System release. Now unfortunately, while the Sega Master System port of Outrun is pretty good, this version on the MSX2 just isn't. The cars are too hard to avoid, the road is too thin, and it just doesn't open up as much as the SMS port of the game. It's pretty tough and takes some practice to get good at. And it's not tough in a satisfying skill-building way, it's tough in the "this random motherfucker just came out of nowhere to ram my car" kind of way. Neither version of Outrun for the MSX is all that great. Now the Japanese version is way better than the awful European Spectrum port, but if you're jonesing for 8-bit Outrun thrills, I say just go with the Master System version instead. It's way better. What you're seeing now is Passing Shot, Sega's arcade tennis game that was ported to the MSX on disc in Europe. Now, Passing Shot in the arcade is alright. Not the best, not the worst, just okay. It has pretty decent ports to the Amiga, the C64, and some other platforms. This MSX port of the Spectrum version of the game isn't at the same level of tragic nonsense as the other Spectrum ports we've looked at so far, but it's also not all that well made or fun to play. The game features shifting perspectives when you're serving or in the midst of a volley. The control is a little too slow when you're running on the court trying to return a serve or keep a volley going. Your range also feels way too short, and there are definite collision detection issues where it looks like you hit the ball just fine and the game just doesn't react and it seemingly passes through your racket. So Passing Shot on the MSX, I'd say not really worth your time. I mean, it could have been way worse, but still, what we got here is not good. Okay, now we've got Power Drift to look at, which on the MSX is another European port from the Spectrum, and fair warning, we've got about 5 of these left. Power Drift on the MSX has the typical awful Spectrum garish color palette. It has some of that trademark color clash that the Spectrum is so well known for too. Now obviously the MSX, and certainly not the Spectrum, would have been able to reproduce the sprite scaling mayhem of the arcade original. I mean, as you can see here, it's not even close, but only a crazy person would have expected that. What we've got here is an ugly racer with see-through ground textures. The motion and simulated scaling are kind of okay, and I'll give it some props and admit the control is actually not too bad here. The game is a little slow, but the sensation of speed is better than the other racers that are featured in this video. Overall, I'd say this is probably the best playing of the Spectrum computer ports to the MSX. Still, that ain't exactly high praise. So the real question is the MSX version of Power Drift worth playing today? Honestly, no, not really. It's worth a look or two just to see how they did it and what it feels like. But once that curiosity is satisfied, I can't see anyone coming back to it unless they have a really strong sense of nostalgia for it because they'd played it when they were a kid. Okay, time for a slight rule bend as I've allowed in my other Sega game videos. This is the Japanese MSX2 port of Puyo Puyo, which is a disc game. This is the original Puyo Puyo, so some of the rules are a little different than you might be used to from subsequent releases. This version of Puyo Puyo features an endless mode a la Tetris and also a puzzle mode sort of like Pack Attack. Now this version of the game was also released on the Famicom in Japan, and if you've played Game Gear Puyo Puyo, the puzzle mode in this one is similar to that one. Now I'm including this in the video because while Compile made this game, Sega has since purchased the rights to Puyo Puyo and have owned it for years, so I think it's fair to put it in a video covering all Sega games. So how's the game? Well, it's pretty good despite the fact that it's got some weird quirks that they would work out in later releases of the series. First, the speed of your falling Puyos changes way too often. It doesn't just happen as your level increases, it seemingly just keeps happening as you clear Puyos, and it gets super fast until it eventually slows down again and starts a repeating cycle. Carbuncle can also drop and trace a path through some of your Puyos, clearing out all the ones he touches. Now overall, this initial release of Puyo Puyo is pretty interesting and I'd say worth looking at. It'll probably just make you yearn to play one of the awesome newer versions of the game, but you can still have fun with this one, and the puzzle mode gives you something else interesting to do with it. I say, check it out for yourself. RoboRest 2001. This game came out in 1986, when everyone thought that the year 2000 would be a magical time with flying cars, floating cities, and apparently giant fighting robots. If you want proof that Sega can design, or at least co-design, an absolutely terrible arcade game, well, here you go. This one is no fun at all to play, which is too bad because ordinarily giant robots beating the hell out of each other in a ring with wrestling moves sounds like a recipe for success. It looks kinda so-so for the time it came out. I mean, despite having different movesets, it's hard to get your stupid robot to actually do much of anything. The game is a pretty standard wrestling game despite the out-there theme. You have to pin your opponent, you can jump out of the ring for a little while, and more wrestling shenanigans can ensue. What it does have going for it is some of the most hilarious English I've ever seen. Check out the spelling of some of the names of the wrestling moves. Now, the game was ported to the MSX by Micronet, and, well, it's also not too good. It's basically just a scaled-down, worse-looking version of the arcade original. I just didn't like this one at all myself. It seems badly designed and unintuitive. If you're a robot or wrestling game super fan, well, maybe you'll find something to enjoy here. But personally, I found this one to be vastly inferior to Champion Wrestling, and boy is that saying something. Here's another Spectrum port that was available in European markets. This time, it's Scramble Spirits. Arcade Scramble Spirits was bland and forgettable. It just lacked anything to help set it apart from the many superior vertically scrolling shooters, or shmups, that were available at the time it came out. I mean, it's mostly at least playable, it's just not very much fun or memorable. On the MSX, however, this garbage European Spectrum port is just god-awful trash. I can only imagine how many children must have openly wept at this ugly game-like thing as it assaulted their eyes. You can't even see what's going on most of the time. In a shooter, it's a little bit important to be able to see what's happening. It's slow, real slow, and at times, I mean, this game is just indecipherable. And you know what? I just can't, in good conscience, subject you to any more of this. Next! Yuck! Poor Joe Musashi has seen better days, that's for sure. This MSX version of Shinobi is yet another slapdash Spectrum port. Calling it garbage would be an insult to garbage. There's so much wrong here, where do I even begin? First up, it's ugly as f***. Second, the sound is bad. Third, the control is a train wreck and super unresponsive. Fourth, well, let's just say 4th through 100th, it's just not any fun. I mean, the pace of Shinobi on MSX is downright glacial. If you thought Sega Master System Shinobi was a bit on the slow side, the MSX version says, hold up, I can run at 1/3 the speed of that game. And also the graphics are just kind of sloppy and once again sort of cryptic. It doesn't even look like you can jump up to a higher plane in the first level, but it's there. When I first played this version of the game, I thought the higher levels were just cut from the game, but no, they are in fact there. And then after getting through all of Mission 1, which took way too long at the speed at which this game runs, I just couldn't take it anymore. Is MSX Shinobi worth playing? Not even close. This is refuse of the highest order. Or lowest, whichever of those things is worse. Space Harrier 2 was never an arcade game. It debuted on the Mega Drive/Genesis, but it did manage to get ported to a number of Western computer platforms like the Amiga, C64, Spectrum, and oh god, it's another Spectrum port, isn't it? Yeah, here we go again. If you thought it was too easy to see what was going on in Scramble Spirits, Space Harrier 2 is here to fix that problem. Despite the relatively simple graphics, it still gets near impossible to tell what's going on at times. I died more than once, and I couldn't even figure out what the hell hit me. And that's just not what you look for in most fast-paced action games, is it? The only real positive thing I have to say here is that I do like this version of the game's rendition of the main Space Harrier 2 theme. They actually did a nice job on that. Is it worth playing this version of Space Harrier 2 just to hear the music? No, definitely not even close. You might extract a smidgen of fun from this one if you have young eyes that can distinguish one same color thing overlapping another same color thing for extended periods of time. Otherwise, check it out here and then let us never speak of this game again. Thunderblade is an incredible arcade game. One of the most impressive sprite scaling titles ever made. I mean, the arcade version totally blew me away the first time I saw it. It has a few pretty okay ports to some surprising platforms, like the X68000 and even the Commodore 64. There were lots of ports to other Western home computers, like the Amiga, the Atari ST, the Spectrum, and crap. Yes, it's another Spectrum port. From a gameplay perspective, Spectrum Thunderblade is junk, trash, garbo, and on the MSX, it's even worse. When the game first starts, before you even move, you're aggressively assaulted by the bullets of off-screen enemies. It's truly one of the most ridiculous gaming experiences I've ever had. If you actually manage to take off and then get moving, there are some things that are kind of visually impressive here. The buildings shift and scale not unlike the other Western computer ports. We've still got primarily monochrome visuals, but the scaling and shifting effects are pretty convincing for such limited hardware. Now the gameplay, as I said earlier, is just flat out bad. The enemies here fire early and often. I mean, they start shooting at you before they come into view, which makes dodging some of these bullets next to impossible. The control is also really slow and laggy, and when you fire, your own bullets and missiles, it feels like you're straining the poor MSX to the max. Now on the plus side, I will at least say that it does have the changing perspectives, so we've got the overhead view, the chase view, and then sort of the special overhead view for assaulting the large boss-style vehicles. So is Thunderblade on the MSX worth playing today? Not really. I mean, get an eyeful here, maybe say a slightly approving, to the visuals, and then just commit them to memory where they can live forever. Well, at least until you die. Because you know you're gonna die someday, right? You're welcome for that reality check. Pinball video games are, well, certainly a thing. This is Time Scanner, an arcade pinball game from Sega. Its gimmick was time travel to a few different tables. And sure, that definitely gives it a little bit of variety. In the end, I'd say Time Scanner in the arcade was just alright. I mean, I'd much rather play Devil's Crush or even David's Midnight Magic myself. But Time Scanner is definitely not a bad game in the arcade. We saw the horrendous C64 port a while back. Now have a look at the horrendous European MSX port, which is in turn a port of the horrendous ZX Spectrum port. MSX Time Scanner is slow, like so many of these Spectrum ports. The frame rate stinks, which can make keeping track of the ball and timing your flipper flips way harder than they should be. I just have to wonder if these publishers or developers actually tried playing any of this crap they foisted on the poor gaming public. Someone should have realized that this wasn't gonna fly long before the game ever hit store shelves. Now the only positive thing I can say here is it's not quite as god-awful as the C64 version. MSX Time Scanner, though, they should have called it Waste of Time Scanner. See what I did there? Next! Here's our final game of the episode. Zaxxon is, of course, Sega's iconic isometric shooter from the early 80s. You controlled the height of your ship as well as its horizontal positioning. It was fast, fluid, and despite a bit of a learning curve, really fun to play once you got it all figured out and could survive for more than 5 seconds without exploding. Zaxxon was ported to many different platforms, including the MSX here. This is the Japanese MSX release of the game. Sure, it's got that trademark MSX choppy scrolling, but overall, this isn't too bad a version of Zaxxon. The control is fine, it handles okay, it has the essentials that make Zaxxon, well, Zaxxon. It's not as good as the C64 releases as far as home computers go, but definitely not bad. They even added a nice little tune in the background. Now, just like on the C64, there's a second Zaxxon release for the MSX. This one is a European release, and thank all of creation, it's not a Spectrum port. This one looks and plays pretty similarly to the Japanese version, but you can tell it's a different game. And, well, what do you know? This one is also pretty good. The sound's a little annoying here with this sort of constant droning that they added, and there's some different stuff to it. so it actually provides a fairly unique experience when compared to the other version. Which version of MSX Zaxxon is superior? It's kind of a tough call, actually. They're both pretty decent for the platform. Neither one compares to the arcade version or the nice and smooth C64 ports, but I'd say they're both worth checking out at least. Go ahead, give them a shot. Okay, so there we go, a look at every single official Sega game released on the MSX platform. So what conclusions can we draw now that we've seen them all? Well, Sega's showing on this platform really wasn't all that great, and there are a few reasons for that, which I'll get into right now. Now the first and obvious one is when the MSX platform sort of came into being in 1983, Sega had also, launched their own first home hardware that year in the form of the SG-1000, which was incredibly similar, near identical in a lot of ways, to the MSX platform. Because of that, a lot of Sega's early games for that machine also ended up on the MSX, because they were so easy to port. Once Sega got a little bit deeper into the home hardware market, releasing updated consoles like the Mark III and Sega Master System, they wisely realized that it was better for them to throw all their support behind their own platforms rather than somebody else's. So their games typically ended up there, and very few of them were ported, after the Master System came around. Now the big exception to that are the European MSX Sega ports, which sadly were primarily ported from the ZX Spectrum. And this is particularly aggravating because the MSX had specialized hardware that the Spectrum didn't. So those lazy ports took literally no advantage of the MSX's capabilities. So they didn't even use things like hardware sprites when they could have. And as you saw, pretty much all of those Spectrum ports are a disaster and barely worth looking at. Now I want to stress again as we close here, there are a lot of really great games on the MSX platform. If you spend some time digging around in its catalog, you will find stuff that you like, and you will find stuff that is surprisingly well done. The only real problem here is that the really great MSX games came from other developers. We don't really see any, AAA stuff from Sega themselves. Ah well, what can you do? At least there were a few that were really interesting to take a look at. So what are your thoughts on the Sega games on MSX? Is there anything here that you saw for the first time? Anything you have fond memories of playing as a kid? Do you want to yell at me for denigrating your beloved ZX Spectrum? Feel free to let me know anything you want in the comments. And that'll do it for this video, my retro gaming friends. If you enjoyed the video, please toss it a like and share it online somewhere. If you haven't yet, hey, go ahead, subscribe to the channel. Hit the notification bell so you'll never miss another of my videos. Also, I've got brand new channel memberships if you want to help support the channel, and there's always Patreon and Ko-fi. With that, I'll say thanks for watching, and see me later.